It is my great pleasure on behalf of all of the organizing bodies to welcome mes amis, Achille Mbembe and Bernard Stiegler, as well as Scott Lash, of course. The format is going to be as follows. We circulated some topics to both Bernard and Achille, and they're going to make some opening statements, and then we'll either return to those topics or just carry on with trajectories that emerge from their interactions. And this is slated to go till 12, at which time there is lunch, but if we need to go over, you can maybe eat a little bit less at lunch. But we intend to, at some point, have Q&A and some conversation, okay? So without any further ado, Achille Mbembe.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say how delighted I am to meet Bernard for the first time. Bernard has been, for a number of us, our companion for a number of years, if only through the immense production of ideas he has been involved in. I have been reading his work for quite some time, and as we saw last night, Bernard, during your keynote address, a key feature of your work is not only the kind of conceptual creativity you exhibit, it is also the fact that it is deeply anchored in various traditions of Western philosophy. It's your capacity to harness the resources of these various traditions in an attempt at making sense of our global present. A present which, if I have to follow you here, is saddled by a set of key incontournable questions we cannot avoid, which force themselves upon us, questions of livability, I will put it like that, questions of solvency, we can talk about that later on if you want, and questions of sustainability and durability. Sustainability, durability of what, if not of our planet, which raises, of course, the question of the future of life on this earth. But if you want, I would just like to, as an introduction, mention three themes which speak to me very directly, themes I take from your work, or themes or questions or problematics. The first one has to do with what kind of hubris the contemporary technical systems, which are to a large extent systems of based on calculation, what kind of hubris do they allow or do they generate? In other words, what are some of the defining features of this epoch of our history on Earth? You and a number of others have suggested that ours is an age of extreme disinhibition. And I would like to highlight this particular question of disinhibition, because I find this suggestion particularly fertile, coming from where I come from, Africa, born in Africa, working in South Africa. But for the disinhibition hypothesis, let's put it like that, to be proactive, that is to be translatable, to speak beyond the confines of a particular region and history, particular metaphysics, we need to problematize it a bit more. First of all, we can argue that the process of disinhibition is not new, and you yourself have shown that. We can argue that, as a matter of fact, disinhibition has always lied at the basis of capitalism. That in fact, whatever we have called modernity, that's partly or largely what it has been. And yet, what we are witnessing right now is not exactly what was there yesterday. So there must be something new somewhere. And the task is to reveal what it is that is new. So disinhibition as what? You say disinhibition as the, I quote you here, the radicalization of innovation. By which I assume you mean the constant search for and filling of vacuums. But also the creation of intentional, conscious production of vacuums in the hope of then having to fill them, and in filling them to usher in the generation of a multiplicity of forms, which end up creating chaos or making each of us, and here I'm quoting you not verbatim, but making each of us a little mad, or as you were saying, is a little stupid, or the two, or both at the same time. Not one coming after the other, but being stupid and mad at the same time. So that's the first meaning of disinhibition. But I mean, speaking from South Africa, if you want, it seems we can also think of disinhibition as a permanent war against limits. Not only the limits of the biosphere, but all kinds of limits, including those imposed by reason as such. Reason in all its form, and you have articulated a really interesting critique of reason, which has been beneficial to a lot of us. But reason, when it becomes unreasonable. And there have been a number of instances when reason has become unreasonable. I don't want to go through them, we don't have time for that. So disinhibition in that sense, in the sense of the distraction or short-circuiting of any capacity to control the effects subsequent to the overthrowing of limits. So not only do you abolish limits, but you cripple the capacities to attend to the consequences of what happens when those limits are taken away. I'm speaking here in very abstract terms, but it seems to me that the history of capitalism in South Africa, especially when we have to deal with racial capitalism, which has been the case for Atlantic capitalism right from the beginning, allows us to push your idea of disinhibition to these extremes. So I want to, as you can understand, I'm asking Bernard to revisit his concept of disinhibition, factoring in it the historical reality of racial capitalism. I'm bringing bring in the thematic of racial capitalism in this debate, in light of what I argue in Critique of Black Reason, which has to do with the idea of the becoming black of the world. I just leave it at that. It would require a long elaboration, but Bernard knows what I'm talking about.
As do we all.
As you do too, I assume. Now, I mentioned 3 points. I think because of time, I'll leave it at 2. The second point, this is in relation to Foucault, Foucault's Il faut défendre la société. Society must be defended. In relation to that, in particular in relation to the last, I think it's the last chapter, where indeed Foucault addresses the question of race and of race in general and of the racial state in particular, which he locates in Germany, at a time, ironically, when, as he writes, I think it's in the early 70s, the only existing racial state is South Africa. But South Africa doesn't appear in Foucault's landscape, as you might know. It seems to me that the work done today by calculating technologies is not only to abolish limits. It's not only to render possible, but to systematize the taking of crazy risks and stupid risks, to continue in the line of what you were telling us yesterday. Risks which were unthinkable not so long ago, among which paramount is the risk of suspending society as such. So far so that maybe now we need to supplement Foucault's Il faut défendre la société with the new imperative, let's call it, il faut congédier la société. I don't know what congédier is, how to translate it in English. Scott is here to help us. Congédier meaning, no, it's not that. It means send on to vacation. Les congés, les vacances. Give vacation to them, decommission it, just decommission society, put it to rest. Let's get rid of it. It seems to me that is the new imperative. And in the sense of unbinding social atoms, in the sense of reinventing the law, so that the law is no longer that which binds social atoms together, but now to untie social atoms, to unbind them, requires an entirely new understanding of the law not as that which brings together, but the law as that which unties and unshackles from obligation. Or if obligations, they must still be, we'll have to deal with obligations that are not at all of the order of morality, but of some other kind of order. And I'll end here. That's where your reflections on the possibility of value beyond calculation become really interesting. They become interesting because in South Africa right now, that's what we are dealing with. And I would say in other parts of the continent. How do we invent a law which produces value beyond all calculation? How is it that we reconstitute some spheres of life that are priceless, not because the value is nothing, but because they escape any form of measurement, pricing mechanism that reduces them to the law, and I quote here, of averages, the average individual, average baby, and so forth and so on. This requires, indeed, a critique, a form of critique, the aim of which is to repair, the aim of which is to heal, to tend to, and to care. And in that, I find what, at least for me, is a very dynamic tradition in black radical thought, the kind of thought you find in Fanon, who was at the same time a soldier and a doctor, a kind of living pharmacon. If I have to go back to some of what you were telling us about yesterday, I think I'll stop it there, and thanks.
Thank you very much, Achille. It's really a great day for me to meet you and to discuss with you. And I thank everybody, and our friend Scott, of course, Ryan, and all the organizers for giving us this possibility. It's really very important for me. What you describe as becoming black is for me extremely efficient for describing, but also, and above all, analyzing what I call total proletarianization. And I think that this analysis, as it is also referring to repairing. Maybe you remember yesterday evening I showed the last picture was reparation, mechanic reparation. I think it is the real question for me in such the extraordinarily urgent, absolutely urgent situation in which we are, and for overcoming this process of disinhibition that began during the Renaissance, during the 15th century. Here we must remember that Sloterdijk gave very interesting descriptions of that, even if I don't agree with all of what he says. But when, for example, he mobilizes the question of calculation in Descartes, in Leibniz, etc., for transformation of the West based on the church and belief into barbarity, and all the question you address yourself, it's very, very efficient. What kind of hubris, you asked? Many kinds. Now, of course, I think today almost everybody is now capable to understand that calculation is hubris, even if we believe in him. I don't remember his name now. The founder of Facebook is saying, Zuckerberg, even himself is saying now, oh yes, we should maybe limit a little bit. So everybody sees that. Now for me, the real danger is today what I call the production by the pharmacon of the pharmakos. That is the scapegoat, the generalization of designation of scapegoats in a situation in which everything becomes unlivable, insolvent, and unsustainable. This is now the very, very dangerous situation in which we are. We said yesterday with Susanna that at the end, in Finland, it was not completely a catastrophe, but somewhere in France, for example, it becomes very, very bad. I say that because of elections, European elections, etc., etc. Now, what is disinhibition? As it produces through a toxic pharmacology, I call that in a book dedicated to an analysis of the National Front in Paris, in France, pharmacosophie, that is a kind of so-called wisdom based on the designation of a pharmacos. That is a very difficult question, because if you read, for example, every society is based on such a process of designation of a victim, of a scapegoat. Not only monotheism, but Greece, tragic Greeks, Greek culture, India, everywhere at the end, everywhere. And it is also the question of Roberto Esposito in Comunitas. He calls that the question of the delinquere. I think that today this question is completely transformed by what I call disinhibition as a libidinal diseconomy. What does that mean, libidinal diseconomy? It means that for a long time, even if it was only a kind of, let's call that, fiction or even storytelling, we could say, with an anachronism, when, for example, the European came in America, in Africa, etc., they were also always saying, we are bringing Jesus Christ. And we are, at the end, even if we are producing evil, at the end, it's civilization as a process of, let's call that sublimation or idealization. For a very long time, the West was always justifying his crimes under such a point of view, such an argument. But now it's finished. It's only efficiency. It's only calculation. Nothing is not calculable. Everything is calculable. And this is the destruction of the West itself. Because what you describe when you talk about the becoming black, it is the becoming black of the West itself. That is the destruction of the West by the West. And by something that is not yet really the West, because it's not really the civilization that the West was. As every civilization, that is also a de-civilization. So what is for me absolutely new in the current situation is what I call purely computational capitalism. For a very long time, capitalism was not purely computational. This is what was thought by Max Weber, and Max Weber announced that. He said it will become a purely computational capitalism, and it will produce problems at this time. We are now confronted with this situation that is accomplished, and this is also what was called the last stage of nihilism by Nietzsche. Here appears what I call a new form of totalization in the sense of Zinoviev, because Zinoviev described totalitarianism as totalization, as a reduction of the individuals into a matter of calculation. And so now it's not only the so-called justification of sublimation by Jesus Christus or enlightenment, etc., etc., that is disappearing. It is also the struggle against totalitarianism. And it's extremely dangerous because it is a justification for neo-totalitarianism to struggle against such a totalitarianism. And if you see, for example, or if you listen to the discourse of the National Front in France today, very often I listen to people saying, but they're right. They're right. They are designating the real questions. And why is it the case? It is because the destruction of democracy, the destruction of politics, reached a so strong level, so high level, that now everything is possible to justify the combat against such a situation. And this is the reason for which it is so dangerous. Now we must understand that in between, for example, Donald Trump and Peter Thiel, there is an agreement of cooperation. In a way, Trump is denouncing such a situation when he says we have to reconstruct America, etc., etc. But he works with Peter Thiel, who is the actor of such a situation. And it's a very, very new situation in which we have to analyze politically and economically these realities, and it is extremely difficult. So the task is extremely hard. For me, this disinhibition, as it is producing this, stupidity and madness, is yes based on what is called disruption. That is the speed by which right, reason, science, debate, public debates, political debate, always arrives too late. Mm-hmm. It's always too late. And we have here to rethink what was said by Hegel about what is such a lateness, but in a new reading of Hegel. Because it's not the one of Hegel that is happening, even if I think it is very important to reread Hegel here with Marx. And with what was said by Marx in the Grundrisse about, he didn't use the word innovation or disruption, but he described it in the Grundrisse, in the famous fragment of machines and automata. Now we are confronted with the question of limits at the extreme limit of eschatology. So we are confronted with a new question of eschatology and of apocalypse necessarily. Here, for me, the question is, what is Gestalt, as I referred to yesterday with Heidegger, and how can we go further beyond Heidegger for reappropriating and co-appropriating, as it was said yesterday about Organised, but not only with Heidegger. And for that, I think we have to rethink the process of disinhibition from the process of exosomatization. What is capitalism? Industrial capitalism, mainly. But before industrial capitalism, also the capitalism of Renaissance, precisely, for example, conquering new territories, etc., etc. Such a capitalism is making free the possibility of exosomatization with no limits given, for example, the church, by the church. When immanency becomes the new political stake as it is described for me by Machiavelli. This is for me what is the real stake of the Prince of Machiavelli.
We only have about 10 minutes left, or 20.
Let me finish, excuse me.
You'll take the whole 20, carry on, yeah.
Yes, but I know you want to speak, but
well, I asked you about
I have
life.
to finish.
Life.
You always want to speak, but I must finish.
And I never can with you.
Yes, but Achille asked me something, so I must answer, Here, the question of Gestalt as a new form of exosomatization for me is the context in which the becoming black appears and in which we have to answer your question about Russian capitalism. And here I would like to quote Glissant when he says, I don't remember in which book, that his work on creolization passes through jazz and the articulation of African American people practicing or practicing radio phonographic. He doesn't say that himself, but I think because he refers to jazz for explaining what is creolization. And I say that because for me, and I will finish with that, it is very important to articulate your question, the question of Glissant, but also, of course, of many other thinkers. You quote Fanon, etc. And with the question of techniques and technology. Why? Because when you talk about repairing, for example, the culture of Dogon civilization, and the question of to repair, it is to take care of the pharmacon for me, and it is to not to reject technology, but to prescribe technology in a new way. And this is, for me, the question of the struggle against the destruction of society. This destruction of society was a project of Margaret Thatcher. It happened with the Conservative Revolution. And now the Conservative Revolution was transformed into libertarianism. And this is extremely important to understand that such an evolution is linked to an evolution of technology as a technology of computation, but also to understand that a technology of computation or for computation is also a technology for the incalculable. And it's poetry. This is the reason for which yesterday I referred to poetry as calculation. The question is to produce a new culture, a new understanding at the global level of culture for struggling against averaging. Because I will stop with that. In my last book, I referred to Robert Musil as a Nietzschean thinker because he said he was inheriting Nietzsche. And he described this man without qualities as a process of averaging. He described what is happening now 1 century before it happened. And here the question is how to produce. I don't follow completely Robert Musil in his interpretation of the situation, but I go back to Nietzsche. How is it possible to produce bifurcations? For me, this question is a question of political economy. And this is the reason for which in the group Ars Industrialis we say we have to go beyond Marx, with Marx, for rereading, for example, the Grundrisse, and to claim that the automation calculation is given the possibility to produce new forms of knowledge that are the only possibilities to produce bifurcations. And then when I say knowledge, it's not academic knowledge. Yes, I stop now. Thank you.
I prefer maybe.
Very quickly, I just wondered if you guys, both of you talk about life, the organic, and also necro-politics. And I wonder if we can bring here into this conversation life, death, but also necropolitics and the way that, yeah, I'm a sociologist, and this is just for 30 seconds. Georg Simmel has two modes of, he's got knowledge and then he's got valuation in his money book. And the valuation is based on the third critique, which is organic. Zweckmäßigkeit ohne Zweck, finality, finalité sans fin, the organic. And I think that both you guys in your own way address life in that way. You in your kind of trying to work maybe a new kind of cybernetics off of that, and Achille in terms of not just biopolitics, but also necropolitics. Yesterday you said something about maybe what can we do with necromass. I wonder if you could articulate a little bit how your thought works in terms of the new necropolitics and biopolitics. In the context of maybe what Bernard just said, yeah. Sorry.
In how many minutes?
Yeah. I was going to say 2. But
Okay.
no, I'm joking. Yeah. Take a little bit of time and respond. And then maybe after your response, we'll open up the floor to discussion.
Yes.
And people will just skip on lunch a bit, okay?
Look, Scott, it's a very complex question that you're raising. I mean, I was joking, not because I don't think it's important, but to give myself a little bit of time to. But let me first of all agree with Bernard. Overall framing of the issue, as well as the lines of inquiry he opened up, especially where he ended up with the necessity to let's say not the necessity, but his invocation of Glissant and his call to go beyond Marx with Marx in an attempt at creating new forms of knowledge in an age in which technologies of calculation favor indeed the dilution of knowledge itself into non-knowledge. The question of non-knowledge having been, it seems to me, quite central to the works of the likes of Bataille and a few others. So I would like to pinpoint that question of the dilution of knowledge into non-knowledge and the conditions under which we might somewhat rehabilitate reason, which is on trial today in many different ways. Rehabilitation of reason, but also a new critique of reason, because its rehabilitation passes through its renewed critique. What would be what kinds of resources should we draw from in order to articulate such a new critique of reason, the aim of which is to rehabilitate it because it has been pretty compromised throughout history in all kinds of necropolitical and other enterprises. So that's one part of the rejoinder to Bernard. You see, I'm avoiding to deal with necropolitics and necromass, but you expect me to deal with this. I wrote something about necropolitics But that was at the beginning of the 2000s. I think that I should revisit that work today in light of all the questions we have been talking about this morning. They were not there in that early work. But I have realized that, in fact, we have to bring them on board. We have to bring them on board around a set of discussions that will dominate this century of ours. One such discussion has to do with, is opposing those who insist on the idea that of limits, that there are limits to our Earth. There is no society that can be constituted in the absence of some limits, of a set of taboos. A human being is not an object. There are a whole set of foundational taboos without which the process of sublimation or inhibition is not cannot produce civilization. And there are those who believe that in the principle of limitlessness. Limitlessness in the name of some conception or the other of life. In the name of the idea that, in fact, why are we bothering? Life is limitless. It keeps producing life. Life can be produced in extreme conditions. All the new studies on microbial existence, that is part of what they are showing. That in fact, the fact of living is limitless. The only limit to life is life itself. So a kind of neo-vitalism, which is embedded in contemporary economics and into neoliberal policies. So neoliberalism as a cynical, perverse form of vitalism, which therefore forces us to recalibrate the whole debate on the necropolitical in an age of technological escalation. But look, we are not here to write a thesis. So that's my response to the kind of broad perspective we're trying to paint.
So, come back to the audience. One time, maybe?
Do you want to say something?
Just two things, maybe. When I referred yesterday to necromass, it was in your critique of Black Reason, when you refer to precisely glissant and alluviums. That is not the same question like in necropolitics you addressed in the beginning of the 2000. And here I think this use of necromass, what I call noetic necromass, referring to the bio-necromass. It's an attempt to produce something that is not only metaphoric for understanding how the past can be transformed. The past as it was producing suffering, crimes, etc., transformed into future. Future in the sense, not only in the sense of becoming, but in the sense of what is needed, what is desired. And here I just add one thing for addressing another question you asked me and I didn't answer. That is the question of wealth and value beyond calculation. That's the most important question for me. Today, I think we have to redefine wealth, not only with Adam Smith, Ricardo, even Marx, as exchange value and use value, but what I call myself practice value. That is the value precisely of re-individuating this, what I call tertiary retentions, but that constitute for me the noetic necromass of knowledge in a way that is knowledge precisely and not proletarianization. So we have to reinvent what is work. So it's a question of political economy. So I just wanted to add that for addressing your question and the one of
necromass of knowledge as
Achille.
well. Necromass of knowledge as well.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. We have time for some questions. We have one right up front here. It's faster.
Thank you very much. Where is the question?
Thank you. Michał Krzykawski, University of Silesia in Katowice. I have a question about limits and in relation to Hegel, so perhaps it is a question to both of you. I think that the real problem is that we have lost the sense of limits in the sense of Hegel, because Hegel made a very clear logic distinction between limitation and limit, between Schranke and between Grenze. And just let me quote a short excerpt from Science of Logic. In order that the limit which is in something as such should be a limitation, something must at the same time in its own self transcend the limit. It must in its own self be related to the limit as to something which is not. So the real problem is that we have to reinvent the limits of life and technology in order to step out of the technological limitation we are in systematically. That's perhaps it's a comment more than a question. Thank you.
No. Okay. Any other comments or questions? There's one in the back.
Thank you. This is a question more or less to the last thing Bernard said, but obviously to everybody. What kind of work is reflected in or rewarded by practice value?
Rewarded
By practice value.
Okay, that's for Bernard. It's here.
Second row.
Oh, excuse me.
Well, I just wanted to talk about an impression I have. I think as you are mainly interested in political economy, you're relying on Hegelian Marxian heritage a lot, including Heidegger, maybe Derrida, what else? So, and also what concerns knowledge, including the most advanced forms of knowledge. But in my perspective, I think there is still a fusion, which is of course also in Foucault, with historicity, however you shape it in a new way, with the concept of society and the concept of the political. So I would suggest the question of limits in the political sphere cannot be addressed with Marxian terms, and also not with Machiavelli's Prince, maybe with his Republic. So this is for me a big difference, and also in opposition to the normal thing that will join the historical process, which is cosmopolitanism. It's not the question of cosmopolitanism. Of course, this is also an important question, but I think it's a question of inventing new forms, and this cannot be done by theorists. So that's...
Well, maybe not right now. Do you have any responses?
I think I will give my time to my brother Scott, since I'm speaking in the afternoon. So if you want to say something...
I have an idea, a reasonable idea of what Bernard's going to say, and I want to hear it, but I want to hear what Achille.
You want to hear from me, and I want to hear from you.
No, in terms of, because I'm sort of the same discourse of limits I've been involved in, but I'm quite interested in how limits might play out in Africa and in becoming black and in the geopolitics today's geopolitics, on the one hand, American drones and Chinese infrastructure in kind of global expansion, and of course technology, as you were saying. I wonder how those limits might play out in Africa and in other, outside of the West.
Okay. Look, I'll say since you mentioned Africa, I'll say this. I mean, there are two things that are really interesting when it comes to Africa. First of all, is the oldest is the oldest daughter, son, or whatever of the earth, if you want, and that's where we all come from. So the becoming black of the world, I mean, we can reinterpret it in that sense, in that regressive manner, that there is something African in each of us. There's a kind of universality of the African sign, which critique has not addressed so far, at least not seriously. And if there is an element of universality in the African sign, is not simply in relation to the past. It might also be in relation to the future, which leads me to put out the idea that it might be that the future of our planet will be played out over there. So it's if that is true, if it's not just pure wish, then what kind of geopolitical recalibrating is required of us in view of the centrality of Africa in the future of the earth? That is, it seems to me, a serious question, at least for those of us who try to account for our world from that vantage point. So what I mean is therefore who is taking seriously in our world today the planetary turn of the African predicament? China is looking into that. China is looking into that, but from within its own limits, its own calculations, to use a term we have been using, and part of those that calculation is that in fact they will mess up with the earth more efficiently than anyone has ever done before them, and therefore a kind of puissance sans idée, une puissance that is absolutely huge power, metamorphic power, but without concept. So we have the Chinese project, which is the project of power without a concept, without an idea, with a capital I. We have the kind of, which is another form of yes, of course. We have the American project, which is based on faith in the military. Americans are building military bases all over the continent, all over the world, but more importantly in Africa. The number of American drones hovering over the African skies today is colossal. So you have that military project. You have old colonial or neo-colonial projects, such as the one led by France, which is a primitive combination of militarism, mercantilism, and paternalism, basically, which has shown its limits. So the question is, where is it that we might find the lineaments of an internal force that would posit Africa as its own center, as a power of its own. Especially at a time when Europe is trying to turn the continent into a huge Bantustan. And that's what the politics, European immigration policy, you can summarize it in that sentence. What is the project? To turn Africa into a Bantustan. So Africa can become its own center and contribute to the caring, the repair of our planet, if it becomes its own center and if it opens itself up to itself. It's the last colossal landmass on Earth which can still afford a huge reserve of life for not only human species, but all the species. Yeah. So opening Africa to itself, it seems to me, is absolutely key to the future of our planet and to the future of humanity, old and new.
And this is about reason,
Yeah.
of course.
Yes.
About reason.
I wanted to go back. Thank you very much, Achille, for this. I will maybe try to continue what you said with my own view. But I wanted to go back first to the question of limits and also dialectic and logic from Hegel. I think one very important question is the question of epistemology, as all our discussions are limited precisely by this physics that is Newtonian physics without limits. And that was destroying the notion of limits as cosmos, as cosmology, because the cosmology is always defining limits of topoi. And I think it is very important here to also to criticize dialectic, not only Hegelian dialectic, but Marxian dialectic. And I repeat what I said yesterday, Engels rejected the question of entropy. That is a question of limits. Also the limit of the universe itself, in time and in space, because it is always translated into space, you know. For example, niches for life, etc., countries. So it's a very difficult question, of course. Now, your question about work, what do we mean? Do I mean when I refer to work in such an economy? It's all form of knowledge. For example, educating a child. It's a form of knowledge, and it is a work. Work means opening, openness. To work is, you know, in French, work is ouvrir, ouvrier, ouvrage, but it is also the case in English, and in German, Werk, and it is openness. So work is, as it is said in the Communist Manifesto, it is knowledge, and proletarianization is a destruction of knowledge that is of work. This is the reason for which when we say the working class, it is very bad. It is a misunderstanding of Marx by Marx himself, because he himself used that. He forgot his own view at the end. So I think we have to completely redefine what is a political economy, and in the sense you asked also, where is society and the political itself? And here, for me, we have to revisit the history of capitalism and of consumer capitalism as it developed in America through a perversion of Freud by his nephew Edward Bernays, who said we can manipulate the unconscious and desire by addressing directly the drives. And this was a new stage of disinhibition, you know, through cinema, television, radio, etc., etc. Advertising, exactly. And here I think in such a way, capitalism became really a libidinal diseconomy, and we have to rearticulate a new libidinal economy. But so libidinal economy, if it is always based on the process of idealization and sublimation, this is what is the stake of the S and the id by Freud in 1923, it is necessarily a question of knowledge. And knowledge at all the levels. Knowledge of education for the child, for example, everyday life knowledge, knowledge of how to repair everything, your car, your garden, your health, etc. And knowledge in the sense of academic knowledge. So here we have to redefine a new cosmopolitism, and this is the reason for which we work, and we'll stop with that, with a group of Ars Industrialis, and now another group to the text, on the text by Marcel Mauss that is dedicated to the notion of internation, that tries to go beyond Kantian cosmopolitism, and where we think it is possible to rearticulate Mauss' view with the question of negantropy and what I called yesterday anti-entropy and the neganthropocene.
Reconcile Marcel Mauss.
Marcel Mauss, yes, yes.
Can we have just one more question?
Hi, thank you. I have a very simple question. Maybe it's a stupid question, but I hear you both I hear Bernard speaking a lot about the new, and I hear Achille call for an internal force that puts Africa at the center, and that seems to be something new somehow. So my question is very simple. My question is, what is the new in your discourses, and where does it come from, and how is it going to be instantiated? Who's going to bring it about, etc.?
Yeah, it's for both of you. I think the status of what's of the new, and how we can, what it is, how it can be instantiated, how can it be mobilized, from whence might it emerge.
The new and future.
Maybe what you just said about it.
Whoever wants to talk first.
Okay. Look, the new is, for instance, when I say I, but any African can travel within Africa without a visa. And this is not an abstract question. There are 54 states in the continent, and some citizens of certain states need visas to go around. I mentioned, and this is happening now. I mean, there are 24 states where if you have a passport of an African state, you can go and you get your visa at entrance. That's new. It has never been there. And when we see it, we know that, okay, it's ushering us in an entirely different epoch. I say that because the capacity to move has become absolutely critical in the calculus. I'm not talking about calculation, but the calculus of life. It's new, and yet it is old, because in pre-colonial metaphysics of the relationship between space and motion, it was understood that movement was what created space. It wasn't the other way around. The other way around, where space creates movement or delimits movements, regulates it, is purely colonial. It started in 1884 with the carving of borders and so on and so on. So it's new and it is old. It's the past and then the future in an amazing recombination of things that were there, which have not disappeared, but have been kept somewhat in the unconscious of society, but which can be reactivated for the purposes of reparation at one point or the other in the history of those societies. So it's a complex question that you are asking, and that's all that I'm able to provide you as a response for now.
It's a difficult but good question, of course. You know that it's also possible to say that there is never nothing really new. Why? Because what is new is always individuation of a possibility that is already there, because if it was not already there, it couldn't happen. So I would like to say that, and I say that under what was said by Achille about a new reason or a new critical reason. I think today we have to think the new with the notion of quasi-causality opened by Gilles Deleuze. And repairing is to become the quasi cause of the accident. If you have to repair something, it is because it is accidental. Now, such a culture is a culture of immanence in which you can produce with immanent accidents or incidents something necessary that is new. And this is, for me, precisely the question of openness and work, etc., etc. So I think we have to rethink causality and in a completely new way. Here, I would say about China, because I believe that there are also concepts and ideas in China. We work in China with Scott, and I'm very surprised to see the incredible creativity of Chinese students sometimes, but also colleagues. And I think we could be surprised by that, and it is a good side in China. Of course, there is a very bad side too. And we have also to become the quasi-causality of such a contingent situation. And here, I say that because when I refer to the concept of internation, through Mauss, internation, the idea is also to create a possibility of cooperation between Africa, Europe, China, and America, of course, and also Australia and Oceania. We have to find a new, this is what I call a new peace treaty. We have to negotiate a peace for producing this new kind of reason, precisely.
I think he's talking about a new kind of, that nothing's new under the sun, as we know, but a new kind of reason, really. A kind of reason that does take, a kind of reason that has a very much stronger notion of limits, both in many, many senses. And I mean, I can sort of see a little bit how it starts to play out in China, but also maybe in Africa. Maybe one that's based less on a Faustian kind of individual without limits, which maybe got into our Western political unconscious with the age of discoveries, 16th, 17th century. But I'm wondering how, I'm wondering how, I mean, maybe to both of you the question is, how might this new reason of limits, because that's been the theme that you guys have put down, play out now, both in well, the West or China and Africa.
Maybe we'll end on this.
Okay.
Because there are limits to our time. And to people's patience.
Okay. Merci beaucoup, Bernard. Merci.